I've relived that night more times than I can count, not in the obsessive way that reliving something painful is usually understood, not as a way of punishing myself or as being stuck in something I should have already moved past, but the way you return to something you haven't fully understood yet, something that still has an aspect you haven't yet extracted, something that demands to be looked at again and again, even though you've already looked at it many times. And what I still haven't fully understood about that night, despite all this returning to it, is what I should have said, what the right words would have been in a moment when I had no words, when what was happening was too big, too real, and too final for any words I had to match it. So I said nothing, and this nothing has stayed with me the way something, even a wrong thing, might not have. She was packing, and I was standing there. This is the simplicity of what was physically happening in that room. She was about to move, and I was still. She was acting, and I was passive. And the pattern of this asymmetry, the fact that she was going to act while I was going to watch acting happen, wasn't accidental and wasn't comfortable. And it was saying something none of us said out loud about what the situation actually was and who held more power in it. And the answer to that second question wasn't what anyone watching from the outside would have assumed looking at us. Because the person who held power in that room wasn't me, it was her. Because she had made a decision and was acting on it. And I was the one who hadn't made a decision and stood there in the absence of one, a kind of helplessness that has nothing to do with what an outside observer of the scene might attribute to either of us. I watched her pack. I want to tell you what it was like to watch her pack. The thing that stays with me most is the watching itself. Watching someone you've shared your life with move through the space you shared together, taking the things that were hers. It felt as if the things she picked up were the only things that mattered. As I watched her, I saw the space we'd shared getting smaller. It felt as if the things that were mine were becoming more distinct. There was something in the things she picked up and put into her boxes that made everything feel more real. I already knew what was happening. Watching her pack made it feel like it was actually happening. It wasn't that I learned something new, I just felt it differently. It was as if I'd known this in my mind, now I knew it in my heart too. I didn't know what to do with this feeling, so I just stood there. She didn't cry. I think this matters. I think it says a lot about where he was at that moment. She had already cried over this. Now she was just packing. The crying had already happened. Now she was just doing what she needed to do. What I saw was someone who had made up her mind and was at peace with it. It was a kind of peace, but it was peace nonetheless. Watching it was harder than it would have been if she'd been crying. Crying would have meant she still wasn't sure, that she still held out hope that things could be different. But she wasn't crying, she was just packing. This meant she had made her decision and was sticking to it. Watching her pack was hard because I knew this was over. There was no way back, and accepting that was difficult. I just stood there. I watched her and didn't know what to do. I thought about saying something. I want to be clear about this. The silence wasn't because I couldn't think of anything to say. It was because whenever something to say came to me and I followed it far enough to see where it would go, it felt wrong somehow, either too small for the moment or in some way too large, which would itself have been its own kind of dishonesty. And I couldn't find that right size thing, something honest and real that wasn't trying to achieve something whose time for achieving had already passed. So I stayed silent, present without speaking in that moment, watching and remaining present in my watching without turning my watching into words. There were things I wanted to say, And I'll tell you what some of them were, not because saying them now makes up for not saying them then, but because I think the content of those unsaid things is part of this story, part of seeing from the inside what I felt that night. I wanted to say that I knew I hadn't been enough in the particular ways that mattered most, not as an apology meant to change anything, but as an acknowledgement that I had seen what she was carrying and understood its weight, even if I hadn't always been able to help carry it. I wanted to say that what you doing was right, that the decision she made was the correct one, given everything that was true about our situation, that she deserved more than the shape our circumstances had taken, and that my failure to give her what I should have wasn't a reflection of what she deserved, but a reflection of my own shortcomings at that point in my life. And I wanted her to know that I understood the difference between these two things, even if knowing that difference hadn't always produced the right behavior. I wanted to say something about what her presence had meant, not in the complete way that would need more time and more honesty than that moment allowed, but in the specific way you name a few particular things you want a person to know you noticed and valued as they're leaving. And I had specifically thing I would have named if I'd been able to speak her particular qualities that I had always seen, even if I couldn't always show that I'd seen them. And I wanted those specific things to be said and known before the room's shared space became solely mine. None of this was said. The packing continued, and I stood there, and the night moved forward the way nights move forward, regardless of what's happening in the rooms within them. And eventually, the boxes were finished, and the room began to take on the shape it would keep from then on, meaning it started to feel like mine rather than ours. And she moved toward the door, and I was still standing in the same spot where I'd stood through the whole packing. And there was a moment at the door, a brief, particular moment where something passed between us that wasn't words, and for which I have no words except that it was real, and we both saw it, and it was its own kind of acknowledgement of everything that had happened and everything that was ending. And then she left, and I was left alone in that room that had been shared and no longer was. And I stood in it for quite a while after the door closed, not doing anything, not even thinking in any organized way, just being present with what comes after such a, in that particular silence that follows something significant before its significance has fully settled. I should have said something, I'm certain of this now, even though I wasn't clearly certain of it in that moment. I'm certain that any true and real words spoken in that room would have been better than the nothing I gave, not because it would have changed anything. I don't think it would have changed anything, but because she deserved to hear true things in that room that night, deserved to leave knowingly rather than not knowing, and my failure to say them was, among my other failures, its own particular kind of failure, the final failure in that series of not meeting that moment and its need. And I carry this particular failure differently from others, not so much with a feeling of guilt, but with a more specific kind of regret, a regret that has a completely clear and limited object. One night, one room, one person packing, and a silence I chose myself instead of choosing something else. And this limitedness doesn't make it lighter, it just makes it more precise, more sharply present in the geography of things I wished I had done differently. And this precision means it doesn't spread over time the way more general regrets can spread. It stays specific, limited, and present only in that particular place it occupies, that room, that night. And I still return to it, still searching for the words I couldn't find then, still not finding them, still standing in that same silence I stood in when it mattered, which is perhaps the most honest thing I can say about it. Thank you. subscribe.